All right, welcome to class. This is our Introduction to Political Ideas. Introduction to Political Ideas. My name is Ken Hicks, and we are going to continue our discussion of liberalism today. In particular, we're going to talk a little bit about liberalism in the 20th century, and then we are going to consider kind of the great schism that occurs that kind of intensifies the distinction between classical liberalism and welfare liberalism. We'll talk about libertarianism, and then we'll, for the next presentation, we will consider some contemporary manifestations of liberalism as a political ideology. So one of the things that happens in the 20th century is, of course, you begin seeing the rise of corporate power. You see, as one of the things about, in particular in the United States, America was for many, for most of our history, we were a country without a state, which is, to say that there was not a lot of real governing that took place at the federal level. So over the course of the 20th century, the late 19th century into the 20th century, you had a number of things that were leading to really crying out for the need for more institutional and administrative capability on the part of the federal government. And of course, really beginning with the financial panic of 1896, and then of course the Great Depression, you really see this need for more governing authority. Alongside that, you also have the emergence in the 1920s, and actually even before then, of the twin threats of Marxism and fascism. Now, Marxism had been around, and really socialism had been around for a good part of the 19th century as well. But really, of course, with the Soviet, the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the emergence of a Marxist state in control of a major country, Marxism is viewed increasingly as a serious threat. Likewise, in the 1920s, in the aftermath of World War II, you see the emergence of fascism, which is really characterized. We'll have presentations on fascism later on in the semester. But fascism emerges as a kind of extreme hyper-nationalist variant of reactionary conservatism. It emerges as, the whole thing about the Nazi party was it was National Socialism. And so these are twin threats really on the far left end of the ideological spectrum. Marxism is socialism that is basically innately revolutionary in nature. A Marxist does not believe that capitalism is survivable. There's anything within capitalism that merits preservation. And fascism is decidedly anti-democratic, believing that all power needs to be lodged within the hands of one great leader, and that it is an expansionist ideology driven by territorial conquest. So in the European-speaking world, the principal response to these challenges was to draw on liberal principles and to rely increasingly on democracy. And one of the more important elements of this is the idea of Keynesian economics. Now, John Maynard Keynes was an economist, a British economist. His book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, basically laid out the principles of Keynesian economics, which basically is the idea that an activist government can help smooth out the boom and bust nature of a free market economy. The problem with free market economies is that if you get misallocation, misinvestment of resources, it can lead to inflationary cycles, which can then lead to unemployment, and ultimately can pull you into a recession. In the case of the Great Depression, it was a combination of factors, including very high tariff rates, that isolated global economy, the more powerful economies of the world from one another, that really prostrated the developed economies of the world. And so Keynesianism is basically the argument that you can use taxing and spending authority to keep the economy running smoothly. And so, it's important to keep in mind that the general theory of employment was actually written was published in 1936, which is actually, several years into what would be known as the New Deal here in the United States. And so, to no small extent, Keynes was likely influenced, or certainly, and certainly probably had some reciprocal influence over, how the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was managing the Great Depression. And so, if you recall, again, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came into the presidency in 1932 promising a New Deal for the forgotten man. He was basically saying, I am going to fundamentally change the relationship between the federal government and the American people, and between the federal government and the states. And the primary basis for this fundamental revision of federalism was the idea that the federal government would be used to combat inequality. Okay? A lot of conservatives have made the argument that the New Deal was ineffective at ending the Great Depression. And their argument ultimately is that it was World War II that ended the Great Depression. Well, that doesn't really refute the fact that government spending can actually, eliminate or can actually combat what was going on, the phenomenon of the Great Depression. Because, frankly, the Great Depression was, the American spending during World War II was, again, government spending. Franklin Roosevelt basically took over. He used executive orders to take over many of the largest industries in the United States, and putting it on a war footing. And so, war was the ultimate big government spending program, if you will. It's important to keep in mind that the debt to GDP, the debt ratio to our gross domestic product, was at its highest rate in the years immediately after World War II. In other words, we had accrued enormous debts in building the aircraft carriers, battleships, tanks, bombers, fighter planes, and whatnot necessary to wage World War II. We brought, I believe, over close to 20 million Americans into the military and cycled them through the meat grinder of World War II. That was at an enormous expense. We imposed rationing domestically in that period. And as a result, Americans didn't have goods to buy things with. And so what happens? You saw unprecedented savings amassed over the course of World War II. So by the time you get to the post-war era, yes, the United States had enormous debt. They also had enormous pent-up spending energies. And remember, this was the period when you see the great technological booms. People are buying, more and more Americans are buying cars, they're buying radios, they're buying television sets, they're buying other electrical appliances, washers, dryers, gas ranges at rates that they had not been spending prior to World War II. And so you also have to keep in mind, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, we also committed to rebuilding Germany and Japan and much of Western Europe that had been, basically flattened by the ravages of war. And so again, we continued spending money, but it was money well spent. It helped Western Europe rapidly recover, and it really got those economies off the ground, and it prevented those, the countries of Europe from falling prey to either a resurgence of fascism or of Marxism. So as an illustration of 20th century liberalism, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave an address to the Commonwealth Club. If you ever listen to NPR, I believe on certain, one day of the week, they will have some notable person issue, kind of give a speech in front of this group. This was in 1932 when Franklin Roosevelt at that time was still the governor of New York. He was clearly running for president of the United States at that time. This was clearly an important address for him as he was kind of reaching out to the American people. And he asked the questions, what are the ends of government? Will individual men and women have to serve the government or some system of economics? Or will government and the economy serve individual men and women? That's important. This is how FDR is speaking within a distinctively liberal ideological framework. Democracy for FDR was a never-ending quest for betterment that can take a lot of different paths. And he draws the contrast between the United States, where we kind of emerged first as a colony, but ultimately as a republic. But in Europe, he makes the argument that ruthless men created centralized governments to overcome feudal institutions. And he basically said those ruthless people, ruthless men, and I think he was using that gendered term deliberately, basically they were not kind about it, and they didn't take much account of the needs and the wishes of the people that they were governing. So you had a gradual path to liberal democracy. And in this early period, in the early modern age, you still had ideas like, kings ruled and governments were controlled by political elites. And so in the early modern age, government only served those people who could help those rulers. Okay. Over time, and we've talked about this, in our discussions of democracy, you have this growing conviction of popular sovereignty, which again is this idea that rulers' authority and legitimacy originate in the consent of the people. And from there, political elites increasingly become sensitive to the idea that they bear some responsibility for the welfare of the governed. It didn't start out that way. It had to kind of move in that direction. And while the American colonies were born in that struggle, the American Revolution marked an inflection point because, again, we were throwing off what was increasingly perceived by Americans as a foreign ruler. But we didn't just trash our political institutions that had emerged over that long period of colonialism. So FDR draws this contrast between two members of the founding generation, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Basically, there were some men of goodwill who believed that democracy, that popular government was unworkable. And Alexander Hamilton was one of those folks. He believed that the safety of the republic lay in the strength of its government. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, believed that government was a means to an end and not an end unto itself. And so from these original debates over the ends of government and the role that government should play in people's lives, you get, according to FDR, the two-party system as we know it today, with Republicans kind of expressing a kind of Hamiltonian belief, and Democrats expressing a more small d democratic belief. FDR also speaks of the frontier as the great pressure valve for America. American political life made individualism the great watchword, and the American western frontier provided relief from the kinds of economic distress that challenged political, European political systems. The quotation here is, "No one who did not shirk from the task of earning a living was entirely without the opportunity to do so in the early years of America after the Louisiana Purchase, and as we began that great westward expansion. We discovered plenty of natural resources that provided Americans, for enormous opportunities to develop prosperity, to develop abundance that could help other people in the world. For FDR, the game changer would be industrialization, which would arise in the aftermath of the Civil War. It would raise everyone's living standards. It's important to he elides the Civil War. He does not really speak about the Civil War because it's still a sore point, in particular within important factions within the Democratic Party, right? Any Democrat in 1932 hoping to win the presidency had to get the votes of Southern political elites. And those Southern political elites in 1932 were still putting up statues of Civil War Confederate heroes. Okay? So he's not really talking about that because he's a politician and he knows that's not a subject that he needs to raise. So he's focusing on this idea of industrialization. Government was called upon to aid in the consummation of this new dream. And you're having to accept a certain amount of the bitter with the sweet. With increased productivity comes the emergence of the titans of industry. And the titans of industry line is very useful for FDR, okay, for Franklin Roosevelt, because they are the foil against which he is running in 1932. He's basically saying that these titans of industry have helped create the Great Depression. Okay, so he has someone that he is blaming for a lot of these problems. In 1936, seeking re-election, Franklin Roosevelt borrowed the phrase from his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, describing these titans of industry as malefactors of great wealth. Okay. And he was sitting down at the time he gave this speech, and he had this big grin on his face, and he said to the crowd and to a camera, "They hate me, and I welcome their hatred." This gives you a sense of how ideology is not just about how you speak to people's aspirations. It is also a way of harnessing grievances, okay? So during the early period of industrialization, and into the 20th century, the business of government was not to interfere with, but to assist in the development of industry. This is an echo of one of Calvin Coolidge's, our 30th president's it's kind of a famous tautology. The business of America is business. And Franklin Roosevelt is saying that was the status quo in the 1920s. And look what it's gotten us. So then he starts speaking of the turning tide, the unsustainability of government non-interference in business. The same powerful men claiming to not want to see government interference in government are the first to go to the Capitol to seek, government, help with favorable policies. You also see in the 20th century effectively the closing of the last American frontier and the rise of powerful corporations that are increasingly gathering unto themselves enormous wealth and leaving working Americans with a much more precarious living situation than they had previously. And increasingly you begin seeing people struggling to make do. So this gives rise to the call for trust busting, for breaking up the big corporations and the urge to turn back the clock and to destroy those large corporations. He credits, again, his cousin Theodore Roosevelt as recognizing that he couldn't determine who were the good trusts and the bad trusts. And so he basically, and keep in mind, he credits Woodrow Wilson because he served in Woodrow Wilson's administration. He was Secretary of the Navy at the time. Woodrow Wilson had a clearer vision that the highly centralized economic system presented a 20th century threat to democracy. And he basically says World War I distracted Wilson from his fight to democratize what had become a sclerotic economic system, a system that was way too top-heavy and providing way too little opportunity for working-class Americans. And so you have a loss of economic opportunity. The American industry had been built out. It was already constructed. There was no more new building to be done. The frontier no longer offered the promise of free land. Constantly rising tariffs had closed off foreign markets to American goods. Independent business people were being squeezed out. And America was steering a steady course toward oligarchy. That's an important word. He's again saying that our economic system, that capitalism, unless there is some way of forcing a redistribution of goods, the people at the top of the economic system will simply take and take and take, unless there are norms in place that prevent that kind of conspicuous consumption. And so FDR called for enlightened administration. The task of government in its relation to business is to assist the development of an economic declaration of rights. And he basically says at this point there are two fundamental rights: a right to life and to make a comfortable living, and number two, a right to his or her own property. And today, again in 1932, that requires a government capable of restraining the insatiable appetites of unethical competitors. So you need a government to protect the public interest. We'll talk more in the next presentation about how liberalism over the course of the 20th century evolved away from this kind of welfare redistributive kind of a value system. Okay? But for now, early 20th century liberalism is the liberalism of the New Deal, of basically saying we need to help Americans. We need to help working class people to ensure that our economy is working for everyone and not just for a small number of people. This also echoes the rhetoric today of Bernie Sanders, which we'll talk about in our next presentation. So over the course of the 20th century, and it's important to keep in mind just how dominant liberalism was from 1930, when Democrats seized control of the House of Representatives, until around 1972, or really you could say 68, when you see Richard Nixon win election, and you see the breakup of the Democratic New Deal coalition. Between that period, you only had one Republican president, and that was Dwight Eisenhower, who really was a very moderate Republican, if you will. He really had not been a politician. He spent most of his career in the military. He was not a conservative in an identifiable way. He was what we would probably call a moderate fusionist who included elements of welfare liberalism with fiscal conservatism, with classical liberalism. And so from the New Deal to the Eisenhower interregnum, to the Kennedy and the Johnson administration, again, a fairly long stretch of time, liberals are winning most of the arguments, okay? They're winning most of the political arguments, and importantly, they're winning most of the elections, okay? Some of the most conservative regions in the country elected Democrats in this period. You had Democrats winning elections in Utah, in Oklahoma, in Kansas, and elsewhere that are now considered to be sort of, rock-ribbed. There's never, no way you could conceive of a Democrat or a liberal winning in these areas. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is Lyndon Johnson, and that is, again, a speech in 1960. Is it 1960? I think it's a little bit after that. It's 64, I believe. Or it might even be 66. Basically, the name of the speech is To Fulfill These Rights. And this is a speech that he delivered at Howard University. And again, he is talking about a specific challenge that America faces, and that is the specter of racism. The American Negro, and that's how they described black people in that period, had been systematically deprived of freedom, crippled by hatred, with the doors of opportunities closed to hope. The power of the civil rights movement was a call to action. And LBJ played a really significant role in securing passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960. He had served in the Senate in that period, and ultimately, as as president, was instrumental in getting the two most important civil rights bills of the civil rights period, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, passed. Johnson was, in many ways, a scary guy, but he was an amazingly effective, legislator, if you will. So he's basically making the argument, while freedom is a vital starting point, more is required to enable blacks to fully join American society. And he uses a really important and kind of powerful metaphor, and that is kind of a race metaphor. You don't take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate them, bring them up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe you have been completely fair. He is basically making the point that systematic discrimination over generations inflicts harm on communities, harm that is not easily overcome. So he's basically saying we seek not just freedom, but opportunity. Ability is not just the product of birth. Ability is stretched or stunted by family, environment, schools, and economic circumstance. And again, he's saying basically, that in 1965, America had failed black people. Unemployment for black teens was 23%. Between 1952 and 1963, median income of black families compared to whites had actually dropped from 57% to 53%. Black unemployment was 29%. Black infant mortality was 90% greater than white infants. And that is suggestive of again, the consequences of systematically denying people meaningful opportunities. So Johnson makes the argument that there are two, proximate causes of poverty in the United States: inherited, gateless poverty, and the devastating heritage of slavery. And so for LBJ, racism was personal. Early in his life, when he had just graduated from college, he spent some time teaching at a small a Mexican school for kids that were almost entirely from Mexican origin. And he basically said, I have seen this uncomprehending pain in the eyes of little young Mexican-American school children I taught many years ago. LBJ pointed to the breakdown of black families as one of the most important challenges confronting America in seeking racial justice. And so he is basically making the argument that in order to fulfill these rights, in order to provide equal opportunity, jobs are going to be part of the answer. Decent homes and decent surroundings and a chance to learn are going to be a part of the answer. Welfare and social programs better designed to hold families together are a part of the answer. But also an understanding heart in all Americans is another big part of the question. And that ultimately is where liberalism kind of foundered on the shoals of bigotry, if you will. Because the Great Society began the process of turning many working class whites against the Democratic Party. You see the emergence of what would become known as Reagan Republicans, working class white Americans. There was a riot in New York, the carpenters riot. I think that construction workers riot. That was both against kind of hippiedom, but also it was fundamentally aimed at, kind of driven by racial animus. And it was this perception increasingly that the Democratic Party was in the service more of identity groups than of working class Americans. And so pulling back out to 20th century liberalism, these are the periods, leading into the latter part of the 20th century, from the 1970s forward. And in the 1970s, there was a book written, and another book written in the 1990s by John Rawls, a Harvard political philosopher, who basically attempted to reconceptualize liberalism's foundations. And so the 1960s and 70s were characterized as a period of drift. There were a number of three big parallel trends. The war on poverty was alienating American working class whites. You had the rise of the new left that was increasingly alienating. It was a movement of youth that was increasingly alienating old school New Deal Democrats, especially American labor. And then you had the resurgence of the American right. You also had increasing opposition to U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. And you had broad spread dissatisfaction among liberals over the kind of the philosophical foundations of liberalism. So Rawls kind of comes into this period, and one of the main complaints about liberalism is that there is, the idea that it basically is founded on a utilitarian, the greater good for the greatest number. There was a fundamental kind of hedonistic idea beneath this. And by hedonism, we're referring to a reductive moral psychology that basically says that pleasure and pain are the two guiding foundations of ethical and moral thought. Into this, Rawls kind of says we can think in more abstract terms of a broader foundation of liberalism. And he is trying to establish what we might call a Kantian social constructivist, social contract theory of liberalism. And if you remember, Immanuel Kant was a German Enlightenment philosopher who was among the first to advance kind of a rights-based, law-based Republican view of politics. And so for Rawls, there are two central positions to his kind of constructivist approach to liberalism. The one being the original position, and then the next being the veil of ignorance. And so the first principle of justice is that everyone should have as much liberty as possible, provided everyone has roughly the same amount of liberty. So you need to have fair equality of opportunity. To that end, there is, he advances what he called the difference principle. Effort and ability are oftentimes functions of heredity. Therefore, people can't necessarily take credit for their talents. Society, as a consequence, should select institutions that are most beneficial to the least advantaged members of society. The sole justification for inequality is if that inequality works to the benefit of the worst off in society. And this is the framework that drives a lot of late 20th century liberalism. And it also drives this idea that in terms of determining principles, that neutrality should be the guide for liberalism, that we should not be seeking to drive any particular vision of the good life, right? There are many pathways. This reflects sort of the moral pluralism that exists within the United States, that there are many Catholics, there are many different kinds of Protestant views of what constitutes the good life. There are many people who are not religious at all, who also believe that their lives are equally valuable and that their pursuits are equally to be valued. And Rawls is basically saying we can be agnostic about those things and simply seek principles that drive an overlapping consensus. And so with the veil of ignorance, what he's effectively saying is that when we choose these kinds of principles of justice, of how we're going to govern ourselves, we should imagine ourselves behind a veil of ignorance, where everyone who is deliberating over these principles has no understanding of their gender, their talents, the resources that their family holds, and that should be the basis of how they arrive at these principles. Okay? And so, one thing that you would say, is like if you're slicing a cake and you want to ensure that the person slicing the cake will be equitable in how they divide the cake, you basically say they have to be the last person to choose. That would be the person that they get the last piece of cake. That will make them more inclined to be fair. So against this, you see the emergence of sort of a classical vision of liberalism driven to its logical extreme. And this is libertarianism. And this is basically making the argument for the deregulation and privatization of nearly everything. And again, a fellow, a colleague of John Rawls at Harvard is one of the leading articulators of this movement. And he wrote a book shortly after A Theory of Justice was published called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And in the preface of that book, he basically makes the argument. Individuals have rights, and there are things no person may do to them without violating their rights. Okay? Now, this is taking Locke's argument and pushing it well beyond anything that Locke ever imagined. Okay? When you say that there are rights, that people are, have this kind of inviolable circle drawn around them, it basically precludes much of what we commonly consider to be government. Okay? So Nozick basically is looking at and saying, imagine the state of nature, but with a different set, a reframing of it. Okay? People have natural rights, but they lack protection. That's basically what both Hobbes and Locke said. And then some entrepreneurs decide that they're going to create a protection business. Market conditions in the state of nature would cause rivals. Government eliminates rivals by establishing a monopoly on the use of coercion. That is how he reframes the state of nature. And this is the classic libertarian way of looking at government. From a libertarian perspective, government is inevitably the antagonist in the story. Everything that government does could be done better by somebody else, could be done voluntarily, and could be done within the workings of the marketplace. So Nozick basically advances, what he would describe as a minimalist state. It doesn't violate property rights by involuntarily expropriating private property. There is no eminent domain in Nozick's minimalist state. There also is probably not much taxation except that which is voluntary. He argues that avoids the sins of the robust modern state, which is to say, any kind of administrative state. You would have a radically narrowed scope of government. And the framework under which he is using this is basically where Rawls talks about the difference principle as a way of distributing goods in society. Nozick is advancing what he calls a non-aggression principle. So for Nozick and many liberals, coercion must always be rejected as inherently immoral. The non-aggression principle rejects both criminal activity like assault and government actions like taxation or a military draft. For Nozick, this principle includes the inviolability of non-coercive and or consensual contracts of servitude. In other words, Nozick believes that a genuinely free constitutional principle would allow adults to freely contract to enter into non-coercive slavery. Likewise, Nozick's argument would apply to prostitution as well. These are, in Nozick's view, sinless crimes. If somebody wants to sell themselves, they should be allowed to. That is the implication of a lot of libertarianism. And most libertarians would say, that they're teetering right on the line of anarchism. And remember, what is anarchism? It is basically a claim that we can get by without government. Okay? And there are some out there who are libertarian anarchists, and we'll talk more about them in a minute. But again, this is the idea of libertarian anarchism is the extension of personal autonomy as an aspiration to its logical extreme. Basically, a libertarian anarchist would say, while private behavior is none of the state's business, so too is state interference in economic relationships. For libertarian anarchists, there is no need for a state so long as everyone respects everyone else's right to be free of coercion. Let that sink in. As long as everyone is willing to respect everyone else's rights, we don't need government. That is the paradox that kind of demonstrates why you have never seen the formation of a libertarian state. Everything the government does could be provided by private enterprise, according to a libertarian anarchist. The marketplace would reliably discipline bad actors. Now, we have seen deregulation in action and what has caused, from the subprime mortgage meltdown in the 1980s the S&L breakdown, scandals of the 1980s, to the subprime mortgage meltdown of the early 2000s. Deregulation inevitably unleashes animal spirits. Animal spirits are oftentimes self-seeking, and you end up with bad outcomes. I'm just telling you, that's what happens. So in a market-driven society, while most libertarians claim not to be anarchists, they believe the mandate of government should be radically narrowed to protect persons and private property. The stipulation is that people are rational enough to look out for their own self-interest. I would basically make the argument that this is not an argument for rationality. It's an argument for omniscience, for knowing everything that you need to know at every point in time to be able to make fully informed decisions. That's what they stipulate to. And so if you stipulate to it, then you can deregulate and privatize pretty much everything. And so, imagine a society where public services are bought and sold in competitive markets. You don't have to. We've seen it. We saw what happened in the midst of COVID when there was a severe shortage of personal protection equipment. We saw what happened. So what are the downsides of a fully privatized societies? Economic disparity, inequality, weakened rights for workers, including job losses and wage cuts, weakened government authority that again encourages conflicts of interest and corruption, lack of transparency, uncertainty of outcomes. And overarching all that, probably a spectacular affluence of corruption. One of the great kind of prophets of libertarianism was the Russian emigre Ayn Rand. She wrote extensively within the framework of what she described as objectivism, which was her kind of philosophy that blended elements of radical individualism and kind of free market capitalism and libertarianism. This is an excerpt from her book in 1964 called The Virtue of Selfishness. She begins with a question: what about the poor? Such a question ignores the fundamental premises of objectivism. Objectivism, again, refers to this philosophical system by Rand that had a few basic premises. 1, reality exists independently of the mind. 2, reason is the only absolute. 3, individual achievement is the highest purpose. 4, laissez-faire capitalism is the ideal socio-political system. And objectivism expressly rejects altruism and what she describes as collectivism, which Rand contemptuously criticizes as the idea that individuals' life, liberty, and work belong to a group or society rather than to the individual person. So for the objectivists, they would ask, should anything be done about the poor? And her colleague, Barbara Brandon, would say, if you want to help them, you won't be stopped. Okay. Barbara Brandon, of course, was a sort of a follower of Rand. They had a falling out later in their lives. Brandon remained sort of an apologist for Rand throughout her life. So for Ayn Rand, only individual men, and she uses the masculine for a reason, only individual men have the right to decide when and whether they wish to help others. And that is an innately atomistic kind of approach to looking at the world. There really is no social impulse within libertarianism. Everything that you do is based on self-interest. And throughout her writings, Rand expresses an enormous contempt and frames collectivism in a way that is worthy of contempt. Collectivism makes contextless demands for seemingly reasonable goals without regard to cost, human or otherwise. She cites Medicare as an example of this. The sins of Medicare include for her enslavement, the destruction of medical science, the regimentation and disintegration of all medical practice, and the sacrifice of professional integrity. This is the year, it was actually even before Medicare had actually been passed into law. Rand compares Medicare to the young hoodlum who declared, "Isn't it desirable to have a yacht, to live in a penthouse, and to drink champagne?" And she follows up her hypothetical with a rhetorical flourish, saying that this hoodlum stubbornly refused to consider the fact that he had robbed a bank and killed 2 guards to achieve that desirable ends. The comparison demonstrates first and foremost that race baiting, and we should be under no illusion of the skin tone of her hypothesized young hoodlum, or the 2 bank guards, was as fashionable in the 1960s for libertarians as it is today. So she basically characterizes collectivism as a ghastly unreality. Collectivist goals about desirability revolve around the question, desirable for whom? Desires and goals presuppose beneficiaries. Is science desirable for Soviet serfs dying of starvation while cosmonauts wave to them for space? Ask yourself why she's suddenly shifting from the United States to the Soviet Union and then back again. Science is of value only because it expands, enriches, and protects man's life. Now ask yourself how much science would actually survive that kind of measure of its value. How much of science is the result of experimentation and, frankly, accident? And so for Rand, all public projects are mausoleums, not always in shapes, but always in cost. Another illustration of this kind of libertarianism is Murray Rothbard, who, again, the libertarian creed, no man or group of men have a right to aggress against the person or property of anyone else. Again, that's a great sentiment, provided everyone is prepared to follow it. Everyone is free to do whatever he wishes except to commit such aggression. And who is to prevent it? Again, civil liberties are, again, placed beyond the scope of any kind of consideration, which means once again, we are effectively a law unto ourselves. Libertarianism works for people that have a lot of money and don't want to help anybody. For libertarians, military conscription is slavery on a massive scale. That is, again, and this is an argument, for, what? I mean, you're saying we don't need a government because we apparently will never need to fight against anyone trying to take from us. That there would be no nations in this libertarian wonderland, right? So the United States wouldn't really need to exist because there wouldn't be a Russia or a China or an Iran seeking to undermine our interests. Keep in mind, the Union won the Civil War because they had conscription. The Confederates failed because they didn't, because they refused to conscript. Property rights are placed, again, in a place beyond any sort of question. Libertarians oppose government invasion into property rights or with the free market economy through the price controls, regulations, subsidies, or prohibitions. Such opposition to government economic regulation is often characterized as extreme right-wing, according to Rothbard. But how can libertarians be on both the far left and the far right of the ideological scale? Rothbard makes the argument that, in fact, the libertarian creed is the only logical, consistent position. I would make I'm reminded of Ralph Waldo Emerson's comment that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of mediocre minds, of statesmen, soldiers, and divines, and perhaps libertarians. Okay, because again, you're basically positing a world in which no coercion is acceptable, and so it would be illegal, but there would be no way of stopping people from taking from other people, especially if they are powerful. Rothbard, again, is positing the state as antagonist. The libertarian refuses to give the state the moral sanction to commit actions we condemn for individual conduct. War is mass murder, conscription is slavery, and taxation is robbery. Well, it would be great if everybody played by those rules. Libertarianism is effectively saying, we were not going to have a state, but we're not going to be able to tell anyone else not to have a state. Rothbard kind of draws on the fable of the emperor who has no clothes, right? They basically are the ones saying the state has no legitimacy. And he argues that intellectuals have used a variety of gimmicks to justify the state. Among the pseudo-clothes intellectuals have used to justify state authority have included divine right, the common good, and the public welfare. It's fascinating, again, that in effect, libertarian anarchists are lumping popular sovereignty with divine right. Again, the argument is that taxation is theft. And he basically makes the argument that taxation as voluntary is a lie. Now, again, keep in mind, taxes are levied by people who are elected. And, all spending bills originate in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is a popularly elected body. If we analyze taxation, we find among all the persons and institutions in society, only the government acquires its revenue through coercive violence. I don't think that's true, first and foremost. There's plenty of coercion in informal associations. Think about the mafia and the protection that they require restaurants and bars to pay. That's like their life's blood. Imagine that wouldn't occur in a world where only individuals have rights. Rothbard contends that all other members of society engage in voluntary exchanges, but not government. Government is the robber band that deserves not reverence, but abolition. So once again, you have this contention that the individual is the irreducible unit, and that society is this bizarre thing that people have made up to steal from other people. And to do this, again, he kind of reinverts Locke's arguments about property. Man comes into the world with just himself and the world around him, the land and natural resources given him by nature. Having mixed his or her labor with the land, their right to own its fruits is absolute. That is not what Locke says. Locke says that you establish a claim when you mix land. But there is never a point at which an individual claims some absolute argument to, property. The central core of the libertarian creed is to establish the absolute right to property of every man. And so again, this absolute right to property has two dimensions. Self-ownership, you have absolute ownership over yourself. And two, in previously unused natural resources with which you use to transform your labor. This is, again, I would argue this is not liberalism anymore. This is something else. This is, and one thing we're going to talk about a lot over the course of the semester is the extent to which ideologies are incredibly malleable. And people have the power to draw on different aspects of other ideologies and mix them together into different kinds of recipes, if you will. And so classical liberalism, as it is articulated in the late 19th century, it draws heavily on the kind of, libertarianism as it emerges in the 20th century is drawing on the classical liberalism of the 19th century. It is basically drawing first on that sense in which it is futile to attempt to improve the human condition. The human condition is as it is. If it improves, by natural means. Government is an unnatural way of improving human beings. Therefore, it's somehow wrong. This is the essence of a naturalistic fallacy. And you can see where, libertarians like Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick and Murray Rothbard are drawing on the contempt that early, classical liberals like William Graham Sumner felt about anyone who thought that they could improve the human condition. That is to them offensive, right? Now, I just said, that's not really liberal. It is, in a way. This is liberalism pushed to a logical extreme. This is liberalism taking the ultimate premise. What is the premise of liberalism that we've learned over these first couple of lectures? It is that individuals matter and that they should matter individually. Libertarianism is taking that premise, that aspiration, that every individual is able to become educated enough, that they can be fully kind of self-reliant beings that nevertheless can work towards a common good. Libertarians don't care about a common good. Libertarianism is the get off my lawn, kind of neighbor of liberalism. And you'll find that quite often in political ideas and ideology, some of the harshest fights are within a particular ideological grouping. And again, a lot of it has the sense in which people feel a sense of betrayal that someone is speaking the way they are about a particular set of political values. And so for libertarian anarchists like Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard, it is literally a sin, if you will, and they were both fairly secular folks. They were entirely secular. It is a sin to imagine that you can use the redistributive power of government, like John Maynard Keynes believed, to actually reduce economic inequality. The libertarian absolutely rejects the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, that when everyone else is doing better, you will find yourself doing better, that when you live in a community that has a sense of purpose, where the economy is fully employing people's talents and energies, that the economy, that the community flourishes, that the community has more public space, that people are better off, that people interact with one another in a more respectful way. Libertarians reject that and, in fact, express contempt for it. For Murray Rothbard, and to a lesser extent for Nozick and for Rand, for them, for Rothbard, the state itself is an offense. The state itself is a moral blight on society, which, again, is the partial truth that a lot of cranks and conspiracy theorists rely upon. Government does do enormous, can do enormous bad. Government has done enormously bad things. But to say that because government can do enormously bad things doesn't mean that is the entire story. Government has also done enormously important things, enormously valuable things. And so the more you listen to a libertarian, the more selfish you become, I think. I joke with some of my previous classes. It's almost as if Ayn Rand was a plant. Ayn Rand came from the Soviet Union and came saying she was the most American of Americans. And she began writing these, these philosophical tracts. And academia has never taken Ayn Rand particularly seriously. There are very few philosophy or political theory courses that commit a great deal of time to Ayn Rand. She deployed a lot of philosophical concepts in ways that she seemingly did not fully understand herself. Much of her fiction work, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, were bizarre, overwritten, poorly written, tomes that are hard slogging. I read Ayn Rand in graduate school. Thank God I didn't read it earlier in life. It might have deranged me somehow. But her visions of gender relations are sadomasochistic, frankly. It's really bizarre. And so I used to joke that, I honestly think that Ayn Rand was a Soviet plant designed to come and sow dissension within American culture, calculated to harm, the greatness of America, which is our ability to form communities out of diverse peoples. I asked my government class in one of our discussion boards, is American diversity a strength or a weakness? And frankly, the correct answer is both, because when Americans can work together toward a common purpose, it is a source of enormous strength, of incalculable strength. But when we began looking at one another through the prism of discrimination and bigotry, of saying, well, if that person's doing well, I must be doing poorly. When you inflect these kinds of zero-sum calculations on how we view our fellow Americans, our diversity becomes a vulnerability. But that's the important thing. It's how we perceive it. It's whether we allow ourselves to be divided by these kinds of divisive, selfish ideas. Ask yourself, thinking about Murray Rothbard again, ask yourself, what would be the source of wealth? Ask yourself in a society, driven by Ayn Rand's, ravings, how would science work? Scientists would have to, pass by a board of people. Where would money come from? Where would your value come from? This is the scary thing, that I think a lot of libertarians think that cryptocurrency is somehow going to solve all their problems, because then you won't need the state to have the full faith and credit of our currency. Well, guess what? Cryptocurrency is virtual, which means it is hackable, which means that people who know how to code can get your money and take it from you. And if you think that they're not gonna, just because you've somehow emasculated government, among con artists, they say, and card sharps, if you don't know who the fool in the room is, you're the fool in the room. And so this is where liberalism can take us. And again, one of the things you'll find as we learn more about these different ideologies is that there are many perfectly reasonable iterations of liberalism, of conservatism, of socialism, not so much fascism, but certainly there are defensible arguments for most of the ideologies that we're going to be exploring. And then there are the illogical extremes that politics can drive them to. And it's those logical extremes we have to be wary of. We have to be attuned to. Okay? So, I make the argument that most libertarians are anarchists who have rebranded themselves. And frankly, beyond that, most of them are nihilists who think that if you just destroy everything, magically you can rebuild a better society from the ashes. And I simply don't believe that. I think when you burn things down, all you get are ashes and the toxic waste that you then have to clean up from some, pyromaniac's fetish. So again, the broad outlines that we've seen is, what is it that liberalism says? And I'll repeat this again. Again, how does liberalism describe the world? It describes the world in terms of individual rights. How does the world evaluate the world? It evaluates the world in terms of the extent to which people respect one another's rights. How does it orient people? It orients people as individuals, which, as libertarian demonstrates, is a difficult thing to do. Collective action is oftentimes very difficult. Liberals oftentimes will posit that, we can form communities kind of organically. And in fact, oftentimes it takes some work. And liberals are oftentimes insensitive to the effort it takes to secure those things. As far as a program of action, libertarianism or liberalism is kind of all over the place, right? Welfare liberals would say we need a state strong enough to be able to identify, discrimination and other forms of inequality, and to put resources in the hands of people, and to create laws that minimize and basically disincentivize discrimination and other forms of poverty and things that inhibit people pursuing what it is that is the ultimate end of liberalism, which is personal autonomy. But why is autonomy valuable for a liberal? Again, you see a wide range of differences. A welfare liberal would say, we want people to be autonomous because we believe that the things, the ends that an individual person who is pursuing their full flourishing as a human being, that will make them more valuable, members of a community. Classical liberals would say, I've got mine, everybody else, remember what William Graham Sumner said, the drunkard in the gutter is precisely where they should be. Any effort to pull them out is a waste of time. And a libertarian would say, even government is likely a dubious enterprise, that most things could be done voluntarily. You could have a voluntary police force, right? In fact, we had that experiment with firefighting in the 19th century in large urban cities. You had private fire companies. And the corruption was spectacular. You oftentimes would see rival fire companies, engaging in brawls to see who would have the privilege of putting out the fire. Or you would have fire companies that were setting fires to give themselves something to do. And so again, you're seeing both, the friction points within any individual ideology, the extent to which ideologies can be kind of molded and shaped, and you can get different elements put together. From Ayn Rand, who brings in some radical Nietzschean, which is frankly fascistic thought, into libertarianism. And then you have, other people who are basically making the argument. Liberalism is a fine position. If everyone's, positions, if everyone's commitments are voluntary, then they're stronger, right? People who are fighting for their country voluntarily and not out of some compulsion are probably better soldiers for it. And so again, we're getting back to the idea of what is politics for? How should we view politics? How does ideology shape the way we view politics? And again, that focus for a liberal is on the individual, both for good and ill. I mean, that is the reality. If you are a liberal, you believe that individuals are the most important factor. And that when you begin introducing other factors that ignore individual rights, you're heading down a path that is likely to be illiberal at best, right? In other words, potentially authoritarian. So I'm going to end on that note. We have another presentation on liberalism. I'm going to kind of elaborate on sort of the challenges that are inherent in a liberal or libertarian framework. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more contemporaneous manifestations of liberalism. We'll talk about socialism, about Bernie Sanders' vision of democratic socialism, and what is the relationship between liberalism and democratic socialism. Then we'll talk about some other kind of challenges related to liberal perspectives. I'll see you next time.